The Alumni Executive Board created this portrait series in 2005 to honor MUS faculty members who have dedicated themselves and their lives in service to the school. There have been many changes in the appearance of the campus over the last 2 decades, but these portraits serve as a constant reminder that it is our exceptional faculty who provide the essential foundation for our academic excellence and who are vital in delivering the MUS experience that we all value and treasure. The Alumni Board determined the criteria for selecting each faculty portrait recipient. To qualify, nominees cannot be current members of the faculty, and they must have served MUS for 15 years. There is a remarkably high number of faculty that meet the criteria, which to me just shows a commitment that our faculty have to the school. And having personally been part of many nomination meetings, I really can say that there is a very impressive list that we have to choose from. The debates are fierce, and the arguments are heated, kind of reminiscent of the Red and Blue Society from in days of old. So it is no small feat to emerge as the winner and end up on these walls. With that being said, I'm very proud that we are here this evening to honor the late Peter Bowman, longtime art teacher whom the Alumni Board selected for this year's installment. During his tenure at MUS from 1979 to 2008, as the only art teacher for many of those years, Mr. Bowman had the distinction of teaching practically every student who came through these hallowed halls. And he could remember each one of them and their antics, even decades later. Unfortunately, I'm quite sure he remembered mine because he told me and reminded me, as well as my extreme deficiencies in every form of art. True. But I will say that despite all the reasons that I was completely forgettable or should have been, through the years, Mr. Bowman would always seek me out to strike up a conversation, whether it was at a random public place, at a MUS football game, wherever it was, he would always make it a point to have a conversation. And the conversations were always rooted in his genuine interest, I think, to find out how I was doing. Now, I'd like to think I'm special, but I really wasn't, because I saw Mr. Bowman doing this with so many of us. He had a genuine interest and concern, not only for his students and former students, but for everyone, and I think that's something that really showed. I feel really fortunate tonight, because I'm the first person at the podium. I can be the first to offer the universal sign and gesture that is Mr. Bowman to all of his former students. Most of you probably know that when Mr. Bowman wanted to get a really good look at a piece of art, he would extend the arms, lift the fingers, close one eye, and bam, there it was. It was really something to behold. And I think we all remember the first time that we saw Mr. Bowman famously framing up a student's art with his characteristic gesture. And I think we all wondered just exactly what was he doing? What did he see through those fingers of his? The mystery remained for me until a couple of years ago. It was at a football game. I noticed after a player made a big play, he extended his arms up, and there it was. It was Mr. Bowman's sign, and it was a U. So the sign he made, turns out, not only did the player make it, all the students were starting to make it too. I even saw it in MUS advertising material. So to me, it's an amazing story that over the years, Mr. Bowman's sign has become the universal sign for MUS loyalty and pride. Turns out that Mr. Bowman was ahead of his time. He wasn't looking at art all those years, but rather he was giving a shout out to his favorite team, the Owls. So in my mind, his dedication is unmatched in his love for the school, for his students, and for the Owls. And in his honor, to start off the night, I'll suggest, not that we raise a glass, but that we raise a U. So we'll give it that. Applause would be great here. No, I'm sorry. Thank you. Our first speaker this evening is our new headmaster, Peter D. Sanders. Pete arrives at MUS with more than 3 decades of experience as an independent school educator and administrator. Prior to joining the MUS community, for the past 10 years, he served as director of the upper school at Christ Church Episcopal School in Greenville, South Carolina. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our distinguished headmaster, Mr. Pete Sanders.
Thank you, Jason, and welcome to all. As the person, or I should say speaker, with the shortest tenure at MUS, it only makes sense that I be brief. But I will say this: I'm greatly honored to be here before you at the unveiling of the late Mr. Bowman's portrait. I understand that he was an extremely compelling and entertaining classroom teacher with a wonderful personality. It's only fitting that he joined the ranks of the other greats who graced these walls in the dining hall. I first saw these portraits when I was a candidate for this position over a year ago. What makes schools such as MUS so special is the positive interaction that goes on in the classroom between gifted teachers and eager students. When alumni return to campus, they of course want to take in the familiar sights of the facilities, but they want to see their teachers. I have visited many independent schools over the course of my career, and I've never seen such a wonderful and meaningful example of a school honoring teachers as these portraits in this room. When I saw them that afternoon as a candidate in August 2016, I knew immediately that MUS knows what is important and what is of value. That moment was the clincher, so to speak, for me. I knew then that this school is special, and I wanted to be here. So again, I'm honored to be part of these proceedings. I look forward to more in the future. I'm excited about what is going to take place in a few minutes. But more than that, to the Bowman family, colleagues and students of Mr. Bowman, enjoy this special ceremony, this special moment, and this remarkable MUS tradition. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sanders. Next up, I'm pleased to call on Matt Ducklow, class of 1992, a student and longtime friend of Mr. Bowman. Matt is an artist who has shown his work nationally. He lives in Memphis, where he has run Topps Gallery for the past 5 years. He recently opened a Vertrine-like location of Topps in the New Madison Avenue Park. He attended University of Tennessee, Roll Tide, Matt, and the Yale University School of Art. Please join me in welcoming Matt Ducklow.
Thanks, Jason. Vitrine-like space, yes, glass box. Thanks for having me. The art teacher's portrait unveiling. I wish Peter was here to see this. Earlier this week, I ran into Pinckney Herbert at my gallery. Pinckney was the art teacher at MUS before Peter. He was there to see a show by Maria Valilla, Jim Buckman's ex-wife, the art teacher before Bowman, looking at the current art teacher's ex-wife's exhibit. Small world. Pinckney had recommended Peter for the job at MUS, and I told Pinckney about the portrait unveiling. He shook his head and said in a soft voice, "Wow, I never thought he would have lasted that long." They obviously thought a lot of him. I took Peter's class for the first time in 7th grade, and then I took his class as much as I could after that. I took elective art classes where I would work on projects that Peter would oversee, and after I graduated, I kept in touch with Peter, and he was always generous and encouraging. The feeling of being in Mr. Bowman's class as a 7th grader was an awakening. It was clear that Mr. Bowman was, even though I didn't know it or couldn't articulate this at the time, an artist who happened to be a teacher. There were clues: the coat, his many sketchbooks, his passive disregard for some of the formalities the other teachers observed. But but mainly it was obvious because he was always drawing. Between classes, during class, he couldn't stop. Peter drew in his sketchbooks, on random pieces of paper, or whatever was at hand. He was an example and a lesson and a model. The process is what is important. Art for Bowman was a continuum. After I graduated from MUS, I never witnessed that kind of obsession in any classroom ever again, and I never found a classroom that I was happier to be in. Bowman's class implicitly asked students to question what a successful work of art was. The objective was not clear. It was mysterious. There was no discussion of beauty. As a 13-year-old, I thought good art was mimesis. But the ability to accurately reproduce the subject wasn't primarily what Bowman considered a success. And I think that led me and others to think there might be different ways to measure success, not just in art, but in life. The class offered the unusual, both in terms of structure and in terms of process. Mr. Bowman had a heuristic approach to teaching. Work comes out of work. Bowman loved to talk, but when it came to discussing art or individual pictures, I don't remember him talking too much. He would nod his head affirmatively, even enthusiastically, when he thought you were on the right path. Bowman was always encouraging and could find what was most interesting about what any student was working on, but there wasn't any definitive explanation why some drawings or sculptures were better than others. This was an art class, not an academic subject. Mr. Bowman's class was not going to make you a better person or more sensitive or give you an appreciation for rarefied masterpieces. The point of the class was to be around this man for 50 minutes so he can show you a few things. He might instruct by drawing on your drawing, thereby demonstrating what a confident line looks like and teaching you that art should not be precious. After that, he might go over to his desk and draw, and he might become so engrossed in his own drawing that he momentarily stops paying attention to class. At some point, he might say something hilarious to you or refer to another student as a slug. His class was a place where students could be quiet and interior and work on their projects, and you would get an A or a B unless you were just really obnoxious, in which case he would tell you to get out, but probably not report you to any authority. So you could just wander around and pretend like you have a free period. But at some point, he would tell another student or faculty member that you are a worthless slug and that is surely bound for prison. Beneath the apparent casualness of it all, Bowman had the gift of making the work in class feel less like an assignment and more like something that was self-driven. I guess I was asked to speak tonight because the list of MUS grads who go on to become artistes is very small. I did email an MUS grad who had studied with Mr. Bowman, a curator named Robert Snowden, to see if he had any thoughts he would like to share. Robert wrote, "I had a number of classes with Mr. Bowman. Once a bird got loose in the ground floor of the studio. Mr. Bowman chased its flight with a broom. It was all slapstick until you felt both Bowman and the bird's anguish. The bird, maybe it was a blue jay, eventually left. Class resumed, and Mr. Bowman had us draw the bird in flight. The bird, and what I remember him describing as the space between the broom and the bird. It was a pretty good lesson in metaphysics. Only now, as I enjoy this memory, do I begin to encroach on a real lesson." I don't have any stories with that degree of poetic resonance, but I do remember the first time I saw one of Peter's paintings was on the way to chapel, and the semester before I would have him as a teacher. The painting was hung in the stairwell that led down to the art room. It was a green and brown tree pushed to the brink of abstraction. It was thickly painted, but the expressionistic brushwork adhered to a few simple shapes. It was much an object as it was a picture. The painting had an emotional impact on me that I could not begin to articulate. I was both eager and nervous to have a class with the man who made it. Someone once said that Bowman was the Memphis Morandi. That's high praise. Like the Italian master, his subject matter was an excuse to explore form and color, but Bowman's work had more of a diaristic quality. The trees and buildings he took as a subject were often his own home and world. He never entered into pure abstraction, and I believe his delight in the world would not have allowed it. I still love Peter's paintings, and I still find them mysterious and powerful. They never had the audience they deserved. They don't conform to the cynical gentility that remains fashionable among the regional art-buying public. But I am happy that many of his beautiful paintings are out in the world, changing people through osmosis. Peter's power and authority as a teacher is a direct result of his practice as a painter, and the fact that he was consistently engaged with his art till the end and didn't have his soul crushed by his teaching demands is astonishing. At Peter's memorial service, his brother told a story about Peter's first year teaching at MUS. His brother asked him over the holidays after his first semester at MUS how the job was going, and he said, "Imagine there's a platform, and on top of the platform is a 50-gallon drum. Next to the drum, there are 20 sticks. Every morning you climb up on the platform and get underneath the drum. 5 minutes later, people pick up the sticks and start beating on the drum for 50 minutes. And then it stops for 10 minutes. And then it begins for another 50. You do this for 7 hours until someone takes the drum off you and you get to go home." By the time I had Peter as a teacher, his drum allegory seemed long past. He had incorporated his art into his daily life of teaching, and conscious of it or not, it was an important part of how he taught. Peter was a generous artist who gave some lucky MUS students the chance to witness self-directed passion and skill, changing the way we see the world, our work, and our lives. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. As a Alabama graduate, it really makes me feel great to hear a UT graduate talk about the process. But anyway, so it's now my distinct pleasure to introduce Mr. Ellis Hagewood, Headmaster Emeritus of MUS. He certainly needs no introduction, but I'm going to do this anyway. Mr. Hagewood is known by generations of alumni as an outstanding educator and a remarkable leader. He came to MUS in 1969 to teach English and subsequently held a variety of leadership positions prior to being named headmaster in 1996. Before retiring earlier this year, after a brief 48-year stint at the school, Mr. Hagewood led the campus through a series of outstanding campus improvements, including this very space that we're in right now, all the while preserving the strengths and traditions that make this such a great place. Ladies and gentlemen, our esteemed Headmaster Emeritus, Mr. Ellis Hagewood. Yes, I do.
Mr. Sanders, Mr. President Jason, alumni, colleagues, friends, especially family members who've come from quite a distance across the United States to be here for this occasion. Of course, Peter's wife, Beth, is here. She's still in Memphis. Son Matthew and his wife, Amanda. Peter's brothers, Tom and his wife, Sally. Rush and his wife, Kathy. Peter's sister, Patty, and her husband, Dan, her daughter, McCarthy, grandson, Stuart. They're all here. Very strong family ties in the Bowman family. I commend the Alumni Executive Board for committing energy and resources to this faculty portrait series, the idea for which was suggested over a decade ago by our Director of Advancement, Mr. Perry DeMint. Thank you, Perry. These paintings remind us each day of distinguished teachers who've helped make MUS a great school, teachers who have a revered place in the hearts of MUS alumni. They connect current students and new faculty to the tradition of excellence, excellence in teaching, and to the idiosyncratic personalities that mark the illustrious history of the MUS faculty. Today, Peter Bowman rightly takes his place among the pantheon already memorialized on the walls of this space. Now, much of what I will say this evening comes from the recollections of friends and colleagues. All of us who knew Peter loved him. We loved him for his art. After all, he was one of the more significant artists in Memphis. We loved him for his often unhallowed but accurate observations about students or events of the day. He was a rare but winsome combination of, at times, bewildered naivety, and at other times, a trenchant perceptiveness. All of us have unforgettable memories of him. We loved him because he loved us. He cared profoundly about MUS and his friends on the faculty and staff. In his short book, The Romance of Boys' Schools, Dr. Richard Hawley, longtime headmaster at University School in Cleveland, suggests that, quote, when teachers are singled out for story treatment, two qualities tend to be celebrated: genuine eccentricity and long-standing service. Peter qualifies in both categories. Dr. Hawley goes on to make the case that because boys' schools have thus far been somewhat free from the regulatory hand of the state, they have the freedom to allow individual personality among their faculty, personality that can be vigorously communicated in a relatively coherent setting. Thus, a school like MUS is small enough so that a teacher's personality can register school-wide, and Peter's did. The MUS experience has never encouraged its faculty to answer to a uniformity of conditions to such a degree that the school would ever become faceless and flat. In other words, there's room here for a Jim Russell and a Jake Rudolph, a Skip Daniel and a Terry Shelton, a Betty Jo Higgs, and a Peter Bowman. From Corinth High School, he earned a BFA from the Memphis Art Academy, now the Memphis College of Arts, and an MAA from Montana State University. He taught briefly at Barbara Scotia College in North Carolina, Memphis Academy of Arts, southwestern of Memphis, before arriving to teach art at MUS in 1979. Recommendations to the headmaster here from former teachers with whom he worked at Southwestern included phrases like, quote, excellent artist, end quote, and, quote, one of the best painters, end quote, but noted that while certainly acceptable, he could perhaps improve in tact and personal appearance. Before and during his nearly 3 decades here, his works have appeared in the collections of Rhodes College, Financial Federal, Pfizer, Promise, and the VCU Health System. He exhibited at David Luss Gallery as well as in shows at the Memphis Botanic Garden, Memphis State University, Dixon Gallery and Gardens, Memphis Brooks Museum of Arts, the Lou Art Gallery at Belmont University, Hunter Museum of American Art, Washington State University, Southwestern College, and the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. Lon Anthony, longtime art instructor and sculptor at Rhodes College, once said that he would rather have a Bowman hanging on his wall than a Picasso. Peter's idea of art, however, was personal and particular. Mr. Thorne once asked him to paint the lettering on a big wooden sign that would announce a school activity at the corner of Park and Ridgeway. Now, lettering was not something he did, but he didn't want to disappoint Mr. Thorne, so he graciously hired someone else to paint the sign for him. When I was a yearbook advisor, I once asked him to design the cover of a yearbook. He said graphic art wasn't something he did. And a portrait? Well, out of the question. He was a very good art teacher, though he once described his teaching the way Matt Ducklow mentioned. Peter was an intellectual repository of art history, but there was always a relaxed tone within his art classroom, a welcome respite from the stressful school day. He was a kind instructor, and he cared about the work of his students. Now, sometimes that care exhibited itself in unusual ways. One of his former students fondly recalled a comment Peter made to him once in class, quote, "Some people have artistic ability and some don't, and you just need to try a little bit harder," end quote. One alumnus said that Peter would often take the paintbrush out of a student's hand and seemingly ruin the project by streaking purple or red or black paint indiscriminately across the surface. The student admitted, however, that the paintings always looked a little better in the end. Loyal Murphy was a student in the 7th grade art class with Peter, and Peter covered his pastel sketch of a vase of flowers with a heavy, dark crayon. "Just needs more black," he said. Bill Taylor recalls observing Peter walk over to one of the boys in art class, pick up his work. To Bill, the drawing looked great, perfect. Peter looked at it for a moment, took his thumb, dirty with pencil lead, and smeared one of the lines on the boy's work. Then, without saying a word, he handed the drawing back to the boy. The boy turned to Bill with the look of Edvard Munch's The Scream. Bill said, "I shrugged, turned away, and thought, genius." He had an uncanny ability to discern quickly the nature of a student. He might say, he was a really sweet kid, not a mean bone in his body. Nonetheless, he had an encyclopedic memory for students whom he found troublesome. He could, and often did, recall with great animation detailed stories of the tomfoolery and mischief perpetrated by students who had given him a rough time even years before. Back in the day when teachers entered grades in notebooks on tables in the faculty workroom, Peter would paint a verbal picture of every student when filling out progress reports. For a particularly sluggish student, Peter offered only, quote, "seems to be housebroken," end quote. Comments were always colorful but remarkably accurate. Observing the interactions of boys with their peers, he could detect troubled kids and say how they were likely to act out. The boys loved him because there was no facade. He didn't hide anything. One spring, Coach Austin accompanied Mac McCarroll and Ted Angelikis to the state track meet. At dinner, the boys discussed MUS. Ted said, quote, "Mr. Bowman is a genius," end quote. "Really?" Mac responded. "Really. You know that Mr. Bowman is in Mr. Oman's office all the time. Mr. Oman is trying to figure him out. He never will. Mr. Bowman is just toying with his mind." Bill Taylor recalls a summer that Peter was the master teacher for MUS in Europe. Bill said you couldn't leave him alone. He had no sense of direction. He would get lost in the city. I wanted to tie a rope between his waist and mine, but he taught a great art course and the kids loved it. Loyal Murphy recalled that Peter would walk into a math classroom and comment on the shape of an equation graphed on the board. Peter would say, "That's really elegant," or "That's a beautiful curve and shape. And you actually expect them to understand this?" Shaking his head. Now, he was as uninterested in his appearance as he was enthusiastic about food and snacks. Any kind, anywhere, anytime. Snacks, candy, and food. He was an unself-conscious forager, and he knew where all the candy jars at school were to be found. One day, early in her tenure as college counselor, Dr. Emily Baer, a little shaken, told a colleague that a strange man, unknown to her, had strolled nonchalantly into her office. Saying nothing to her, in fact, ignoring her entirely, he scooped a handful of candy from a dish on her desk, deposited it into his pants pocket, turned, and mutely walked out. She was relieved to learn that, in fact, the candy marauder was harmless and, in fact, one of her new colleagues. But he was no respecter of persons if candy was involved. During the time of Bill Campbell, Headmaster Bill Campbell, Peter walked into his office while Dr. Campbell was working at his desk. Saying nothing, he went to the candy bowl, grabbed 2 handfuls of candy, stuffed them into his coat pocket, and walked out of the office, again, without saying a word. After one Friday morning chapel, the faculty streamed into the workroom, as always, for food. There were just 2 donuts left. So they hesitated. Peter walked in and without hesitation grabbed both. One in each hand, and took a bite out of each. He loved to repeat favorite stories, including one about a North Mississippi high school classmate who had bought a Jim Walter home for his favorite bird dog to live in by itself. And there was also the story of the man who lost his dog in a divorce settlement. He would always add, quote, "Woman that would take your dog will cut you," end quote. He was also a very good faculty member, participating in the life of the school outside the classroom. He was happy to chaperone a dance or attend an alumni function or keep the chains at a football game. For years, he worked the chains at football games, often with Paul Linksweiler and Guy Amsler, a holy trinity of chain gangs. The chains were located, of course, on the visitor side of the field, and he heard a lot of colorful language from visiting coaches, visiting fans, players, including the night a coach continually referred to the crew as pole boys. One Friday evening, after halftime activities had terminated, the officials were ready for the second half kickoff. Both the kicking and receiving teams were on the field ready to go, but the chain gang lacked one important member. Peter had gone to the home side for a snack. Norman Thompson, Bill Taylor, working in the old press box, saw Peter strolling leisurely through the north end zone, carrying a huge box of popcorn in the crook of one arm and a supersized cold drink in the other hand. Somebody said, "Tell him to hurry up." Taking that as his cue, Norman loudly and sternly announced to the stadium, "Well, the members of the chain gang report to the sideline immediately." Startled, Peter began to jog, spewing popcorn and Coca-Cola in all directions, frantically trying to grab one, maybe 2 last fistfuls of popcorn before rejoining the crew. Several faculty and friends rode the MUS bus to the 2008 state football championship game in Cookeville. That bus was driven by Loyal Murphy. At one of many bathroom stops along the way, Peter took Loyal's arm, begging him not to leave him stranded in a strange restroom. Loyal assured him that if he were of a mind to abandon him, he would have done so 10 years ago. I see Coach Peters here, and he had an undying appreciation of Coach Peters, who, as an administrator, had intervened with students on his behalf a number of times. Peter reveled in fond remembrance of how students shuddered with fear when Coach Peters would step in and discipline them. In 2007, at Coach Peters' invitation, Peter traveled with the varsity basketball team to Carbondale, Illinois for the annual holiday tournament there. He roomed with Coach Guy Amsler and thus created an all-star roommate pairing that will never be matched again. Peter often delivered salty comments accompanied by vivid body language to his colleagues, who sometimes relished goading him into a display that rarely disappointed. Usually placid and genial, Peter was easily aroused to unexpected heights of excitation by the right stimulus, which was usually in the form of Bob Winfrey. And before him, lower school teacher Don Walker. Both could cause Peter to explode like a hand grenade. Doc Winfrey pulled the pin often on the Bowman grenade at inopportune times, such as during faculty meetings. And Bob always got a kick out of asking Peter what time it was, and then watching him look at his wristwatch, an act causing him to spill coffee on his pants from the cup in his watch hand. You could usually trace Peter's movements, especially in the morning, by the coffee spills through the school. One of his students from 1983 expressed this tribute to him a decade ago. The student wrote, to Mr. Bowman, I cannot remember any teacher at MUS who was not exceptional, but you, Mr. Bowman, raised the bar to a group of students who could have dropped through the cracks. I wasn't a great academic student, and recently I found out that I have what is now termed a learning disability. You were that lucky teacher in my life who built me up. You always demanded that we maintain the highest personal ethics and a simple joy for life and what is around us. I will always be in your debt. Somehow you knew us better than we did, and as I grow older, so does my appreciation and honor of you, not only as a teacher, but also as a mentor. This story from Eddie Beatty. Eddie said, as the guidance counselor in 1992, I was summoned to the headmaster's office one afternoon. Peter was waiting outside the door when I arrived. He had probably said something to a student that was straightforward and unfiltered. And when we were called into the office, Peter said in all sincerity, if it's in the best interest of the school, I will resign. Of course, it wasn't in the best interest of the school, but Eddie commented, quote, a more heartfelt display of loyalty and courage I had never seen. He was instantly my hero. Art was both need and love for Peter, both a vocation and an avocation for him. These lines from Robert Frost's Two Tramps in Mud Time capture that truth. Frost wrote, my object in living is to unite my avocation and my vocation, as my two eyes make one in sight. Only where love and need are one, and the work is play for mortal stakes, is the deed ever really done for heaven and the future's sakes. Clay Smythe said well what I think all of us are thinking tonight about Peter. Clay wrote, "He is much more special to me than I ever had the courage to tell him. While we are richer for having known him and labored alongside him, both we who remain and the boys we now teach are poorer for not having him in our lives today." Now, Peter was a unique character, a memorable figure in the life of the school for 29 years. I believe that Providence brought him here rather than somewhere else where we might not have known him, or to a place in which he might not have been appreciated. Dear MUS, how kind the fate that brought him to these halls.
Thank you, Mr. Hagewood. Our portrait of Mr. Bowman is by award-winning artist Jeffrey Martin from Port Trevorton, Pennsylvania. Mr. Martin is passionate about painting portraits and pastel landscapes that come alive on the canvas. He strives to make every portrait flattering, reflective of individual personality, and stunningly accurate in likeness. He attended Susquehanna University, graduating with a BA in English education, and then attended art school in New York City at Art Students League of New York, and continued his education at Penn State University, where he earned an MFA in painting and drawing. Mr. Martin taught art classes at Susquehanna University from 1989 to 1992, and again from 2001 until 2006. In addition to painting portraits and pastel landscapes full-time, Mr. Martin currently teaches two interesting and unique classes at Susquehanna University: cult films and the history of horror films. It's scary. Mr. Martin is represented locally by Miss Lizbeth Francis, a broker for Portraits, Inc. out of Birmingham, Alabama. Now I'd like to ask Miss Bowman to come forward with her son Matthew and to join Mr. Sanders and me as we unveil the portrait. You want her here? Up here, okay. As the walls of the dining hall continue to become lined with the portraits of revered faculty members like Mr. Bowman, who have played important and influential roles in the lives of generations of students, we will be constantly reminded of the primary reason that we continue to appreciate and support Memphis University School. Mr. Bowman devoted his life to students and to the school, and his influence will impact so many of us for so many years to come. On behalf of the Alumni Executive Board, it is my pleasure to present to the school this portrait of Mr. Peter M. Bowman.
I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank the Alumni Executive Board for selecting Peter for this year's portrait. He always said that coming to MUS was the best thing that ever happened to him. I've sat with him as most of these portraits were unveiled, and I can tell you that he would be amazed that his portrait was going to be one of these on the wall. He would never have expected that to happen. I think if we listen to the stories that everyone told, that Peter's unique contribution to MUS was that it was okay to be different, that it was okay to exhibit your personality, and to enjoy everybody regardless of what their gift was. When you're sitting out there, you probably see this portrait of a man in a coat and tie, and that's what he wore at work every day. But I hope that you will take a little more time to get a little closer view, because you'll see the paint at the bottom of his tie. You'll see the paint on his jacket. You'll see the donut in his hand. He hasn't yet taken the bite out of it, but it's there. His cup of coffee that Ellis talked about, that he dribbled all over my house as well as MUS. And so I do hope that you will take a minute to look at some of the unique things. Also, that you'll know that behind him is one of his pictures that he painted. And so here he is represented both as a teacher and as an artist, and I think that is the best representation of him, because he certainly was both. And he certainly would have loved to have been here. He would have had so much fun seeing everybody. He always would come to lunch. He would talk about faculty members taking him aside, and there would be a boy, and they would say, "Okay, who's his father?" And Peter would usually know. You know, he would pick it out, and then he'd have some choice tale for some of the fathers. But anyway, he enjoyed his time here. We enjoy being part of the MUS family, and this is such a wonderful honor, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Bowman. On behalf of the members of the Alumni Executive Board, I thank all of you for being here tonight. We invite you to stay and visit, and please come up and congratulate Ms. Bowman and the rest of the Bowman family before you head home. Thank you very much.